The arrival of the students. The grand halls of the Intergalactic University of History and Knowledge buzzed with activity as the newest cohort of students arrived for their first semester. The ancient stone walls of the university, carved with symbols of countless species, held an aura of reverence, their weight reflecting the immense knowledge contained within. Today, however, there was something unique about the atmosphere. The latest batch of students, alien youth from distant corners of the galaxy, had arrived, ready to embark on a journey to study one of the most talked-about yet misunderstood planets in the galaxy, Earth. Professor Zorath, an old alien of the solar species, stood at the front of a lecture hall, his four eyes scanning the young faces as they took their seats. He had long been fascinated by Earth, a planet that many of his colleagues considered little more than a wild card in the galactic fold. Most of the species in the universe viewed humanity with a mixture of curiosity and disdain, as a chaotic and war-ridden species, prone to violence but lacking the sophistication of more advanced races. But Zorath knew better. He had spent decades studying Earth's history, and he was eager to share what he had learned with this new generation of students. The students sat in a circle around him, each from a vastly different species, tall, short, multi-limbed, and even entirely energy-based. Among them, there were three who would prove central to this semester's journey. Xandria, a young alien from the peaceful and technologically advanced Solothan species. Vral, a warrior from the militaristic and honor-bound species known as the Thalaka. And Tirak, a curious and intellectually driven student from the silent, enigmatic species of Anile. All three had expressed great interest in studying Earth, each for their own reasons. Zorath clicked his mandibles in a sound of satisfaction as the students settled in. Today, he began, his deep voice carrying a weight of experience. We begin our exploration of a world that, at first glance, might appear primitive, chaotic, and brutal. Earth is often considered a violent planet, a species marked by wars and conflict. A murmur of interest passed through the students, and Xandria leaned forward with a look of skeptical curiosity. She was from a species that had transcended physical conflict long ago, relying instead on advanced technology and diplomacy. To her, Earth's history, filled with endless wars, seemed an embarrassment, a planet lost in its own primitive instincts. Vral, on the other hand, looked intrigued. His race prided itself on military prowess and the art of combat, but unlike the Thalaka, who had maintained a long-standing tradition of honorable warfare, humans seemed to engage in endless conflict, often without reason or rhyme. Tirak, ever silent and perceptive, only tilted his head slightly, absorbing every word with a sharp, inquisitive gaze. Earth's history, Zorath continued, is not just a story of destruction. It is a tale of survival, resilience, and, most surprisingly, innovation in the face of overwhelming odds. He gestured to a holographic display that flickered to life beside him. It was a timeline of Earth's most significant historical moments, spanning from ancient times to the modern era. Xandria raised an eyebrow. You mean to say that a species that destroys itself repeatedly somehow survives? Zorath gave her a small, knowing smile. Yes, it is precisely because they destroy themselves that they survive. You will see as we delve deeper into their history. The display zoomed in on a massive painting from Earth's ancient past, a depiction of the Battle of Thermopylae, a legendary stand of 300 Spartan warriors against the overwhelming Persian army. The students watched in silence as Zorath narrated the story. In 480 BC, Zorath began. A tiny force of human warriors, vastly outnumbered, chose to fight to the death, knowing their efforts would delay a much larger force and give their homeland a chance to prepare. The Spartans did not fight to win. They fought to give their people a fighting chance. Xandria's skepticism faltered. She had expected the ancient humans to cower in the face of impossible odds, to surrender or negotiate. But this was different. She was seeing something she hadn't anticipated: humanity's willingness to sacrifice itself for a greater cause. This was only the beginning of Earth's combat history, Zorath continued, pulling the timeline forward. He moved on to the World Wars, two of humanity's most devastating conflicts. The students watched as images of trench warfare, bombed cities, and nuclear destruction filled the screen. Humanity had fought not just for survival but for ideals of freedom, justice, and peace, concepts that many advanced species found abstract. Vral leaned forward. So, they did not just fight, they fought for something. Exactly, Zurath said, his voice tinged with awe. Their wars were not merely the clash of armies. They were driven by complex concepts, by ideologies, by the hope that their species could rise from the ashes of devastation. Tirak, the silent observer, finally spoke up. What did they learn from all of this? What did they become after so much destruction? Zorath nodded, understanding the depth of Tirak's question. Humanity learned resilience. They adapted, and most importantly, they rebuilt. Even after the worst wars in their history, they came together, forged new alliances, and continued to push forward. It is this spirit that has defined them more than any weapon or strategy. The students fell silent. They had come expecting to study a species doomed by its violence, but already they were beginning to understand that humanity's true strength wasn't in its weapons or armies. It was in its unyielding will to survive, to push forward no matter the cost. As the class ended, Zorath looked around at his students, knowing the journey they were about to take would change their perception of Earth forever. Tomorrow, we will look at how humanity's combat history evolved. Prepare yourselves. It will not be what you expect. The students left the lecture hall with more questions than answers, their perceptions of Earth beginning to shift. They had expected to study a savage species. Instead, they had encountered a race defined by something much more formidable, an unbreakable will to fight, to survive, and to transcend. The first lesson, the human will to survive. The next day, the lecture hall was quieter, the students more focused. They had all slept on what they had learned the day before, and it was clear that the reality of Earth's history had left an impact. Professor Zorath could sense their growing curiosity. He'd watched as they filed in that morning, their expressions more contemplative than before. Xandria, Vral, and Tirak all seemed less certain of their previous assumptions, but Zorath knew that they still had much to learn. Today, Zorath began, his voice steady. We will focus on one of the most fascinating aspects of Earth's combat history, the human will to survive. More than just tactics or weapons, it is this spirit that has shaped humanity's battles and, indeed, their entire history. The holographic display activated again, this time showing a map of Earth with various red marks indicating some of the world's most famous wars. The students were shown brief glimpses of humanity's greatest struggles, but Zorath's focus was on a few key moments, battles in which the human spirit proved far more significant than military might. He paused, allowing the students to look at the timeline of humanity's wars, before selecting a battle that would test their perceptions, the Siege of Stalingrad. Stalingrad, Zorath said, the name carrying a weight of history. 1942 to 1943, a pivotal battle of the Second World War. The Soviet Union, fighting for survival against the Nazi forces of Germany. Stalingrad was not just a city, it was a symbol. The Soviet forces were outnumbered and outgunned, trapped in a brutal winter, surrounded by the enemy. The battle raged for months, in the freezing cold, through relentless bombardment. And yet, the hologram flickered, showing images of soldiers huddled in trenches, women and children working to fortify their defenses, and civilians fleeing the city. The images were grim, but they painted a picture of defiance in the face of almost certain defeat. The Soviet soldiers and civilians of Stalingrad were not fighting for land, nor were they fighting for glory, Zorath continued. They were fighting for survival, for their homes, for their families. They knew that if Stalingrad fell, it would open the door for a Nazi invasion of the entire Soviet Union. They had nothing left to lose. Vral, ever the soldier, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. But surely, there were better ways to approach such a situation. To face such overwhelming odds, surely they knew they would lose. Zorath nodded thoughtfully. Yes, and that is what makes Stalingrad so remarkable. They fought not for victory, but because the alternative, surrender, was unthinkable. It was the will to survive, to protect what they loved, that drove them forward. And in the end, Despite the unimaginable odds, the Soviet forces pushed the Nazis back. The students fell silent as they absorbed this. Stalingrad was not just a military conflict. It was a testament to humanity's unyielding spirit. It was a fight driven by something deeper than mere tactics or strategy. It was about survival. The survival of a people, of a city, of a culture. Zoratha's voice broke the stillness. This is not an isolated case. Humans, again and again, show the same pattern throughout their history. They are a species defined not by the number of victories they win, but by their ability to endure. The screen shifted, now showing the dark days of World War II, the bombings of London, the destruction of Warsaw, the invasion of Normandy. But there was something different in the images. Despite the ravaged landscapes, the dead bodies, the ruined cities, humanity always seemed to recover. Humanity, Zorath said softly, has faced the brink of annihilation twice, first with the global conflicts of the world wars, and then with the advent of nuclear weapons. Yet, even after dropping atomic bombs on their own kind, they rebuilt. They reconciled. They went on to become the very species that would eventually send their first humans to the moon. Xandria, who had been skeptical of Earth's potential from the start, spoke up, her voice laced with confusion. But how? How do they rebuild after such devastation? After so much destruction? Zoratha's gaze softened. It is the most defining characteristic of humanity, resilience. Even in the face of unspeakable losses, they found ways to adapt. They rebuilt cities, restored economies, and reformed their societies. It is not merely their ability to fight that makes them powerful. It is their ability to survive, to learn from their mistakes, and to continue pushing forward. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The students had expected humanity to be a species defined by violence, but what they were learning was something far more complex. The true power of Earth's combat history wasn't just in the wars fought. It was in the way humanity had learned from each war and continued to thrive. Tirak, who had been quietly absorbing the information, raised a hand, his voice calm. But surely there was a breaking point. A limit. How much can a species endure? Zorath nodded gravely. It's a question that many of their philosophers have pondered. And the answer, at least from what we can see, is that humanity has not yet reached it. In fact, they may never reach it, because as long as there is something left to fight for, they will find the strength to rise again. The hologram shifted to show Earth's early space exploration efforts, the triumph of Apollo 11, the first human landing on the moon. Zoratha's voice grew proud as he spoke of this accomplishment. Despite all their wars, all their pain, all their losses, humanity's drive to survive has led them to the stars. And it is that same drive that will to survive against all odds that will carry them far beyond their home world. Xandria, Vral, and Tirak sat in stunned silence, their previous notions of Earth as a chaotic, primitive world beginning to crack. They had come expecting to study a species that was defined by its brutality. What they were discovering instead was that humanity was defined by something much more formidable, their unrelenting will to endure. As the lecture ended, Zorath watched his students closely. The journey ahead would be long, and the lessons of Earth's combat history would continue to challenge their perceptions. But he knew that, by the end of their time here, they would have learned something far more important than just military strategy or technological innovation. They would have learned what made humanity truly remarkable: the innovation of combat, a tactical and technological evolution. The third day of lessons arrived, and the mood in the lecture hall was noticeably different. The students sat in rapt attention, their previous skepticism gradually giving way to curiosity. Professor Zorath sensed the shift in their attitudes. Yesterday, they had begun to understand that humanity's strength lay not just in its weapons of victories but in its incredible resilience. Today, he would take them deeper into the heart of human combat history, how their battles shaped and sharpened their innovations, making them one of the most resourceful species in the galaxy. As the students settled into their seats, Zorath flicked a switch on the console beside him, and a hologram of a war-torn battlefield materialized before them. Today, we will explore something equally remarkable: The evolution of humanity's tactics and technology in warfare, he began. To truly understand why Earth's combat history is so astonishing, we must look at the way humans adapted their methods of fighting to meet ever-growing challenges. And, most crucially, how they innovated in the face of overwhelming odds. Xandria, always the analytical one, crossed her arms. Are you saying that these humans, whose tactics often appear primitive to us, actually managed to outthink their adversaries? Zorath smiled. Exactly. Humans may not have always had the superior numbers or weapons, but they have always found ways to adapt, improvise, and innovate in battle. He gestured to the hologram, which now showed a chaotic battlefield from World War I, where soldiers slogged through trenches, barely managing to hold their ground. The images were accompanied by sounds, the boom of distant artillery, the whistling of incoming shells. This was the beginning of a new type of warfare for humanity, Zorath continued. World War I, 1914 to 1918, introduced a level of destruction never seen before. The trench warfare, the machine guns, the chemical weapons. It seemed like a war humanity could not win. He paused, letting the weight of the images sink in. Yet, even in the horror of these trenches, humanity adapted. They began to develop new technologies, such as tanks and aircraft, to break the stalemate. Vral, the Thalika warrior, leaned forward. Tanks, those cumbersome machines, were what allowed them to break through the lines. Zorath nodded. Yes, the tank, a lumbering vehicle at first, became a symbol of human ingenuity. Despite its early failures and awkward design, it proved pivotal in shifting the tide of battle. Humans, rather than simply accepting the carnage, found new ways to fight. Xandria's brow furrowed in thought. But that was just the beginning, wasn't it? Correct, Zorath replied. In fact, the real turning point for humanity came during World War II, a conflict that brought even more innovation. This war wasn't just about fighting. It was about a battle of ideas and technologies, a war of survival against the most aggressive expansionism the world had ever seen. As he spoke, the hologram changed to show the vast beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, D-Day. Soldiers poured from landing crafts onto the sand, facing nearly impossible odds. The Allied forces were attempting a massive amphibious assault to reclaim occupied Europe from the Nazis. Here we see one of the greatest military innovations in human history, Zorath said. The Allied invasion of Normandy wasn't just about fighting a battle. It was about overcoming immense logistical, technological, and tactical challenges. The Allies used deception on an unprecedented scale, misleading the Nazis into thinking the invasion would occur elsewhere. This allowed them to gain the upper hand before the battle even began. Xandria seemed puzzled. Deception? You're saying that strategy was more important than raw strength? Yes, Zorath replied, his voice rich with admiration. Humanity excels not only in brute force, but also in the art of strategy and innovation. The deception, combined with new technologies like the landing craft and portable artificial harbors, allowed them to land on the beaches and establish a foothold in Europe. The success of D-Day turned the tide of the war in the Allies' favor. The students exchanged looks of disbelief. To them, this kind of complexity in warfare was something far beyond mere combat. It was a brilliant orchestration of innovation and intelligence. But Zorath was far from done. The hologram shifted again, now showing a more somber scene, the first test of atomic weapons. The bright flash of an atomic bomb explosion lit up the screen, followed by images of the devastation caused by Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The room grew silent. This is where humanity's innovation took a dark turn, Zorath said, his tone grave. In 1945, humanity developed nuclear weapons, an unimaginable power. The atomic bomb fundamentally changed the way Earth would approach warfare, introducing the possibility of total annihilation. It was a weapon unlike any other, capable of erasing entire cities in an instant. But it also forced humanity to rethink war itself. Tirak, who had been quiet until now, spoke softly. How did humanity recover from such destruction? Wasn't this the ultimate weapon? It was, Zorath answered, but it was also a weapon that forced humanity to stop and reconsider their place in the universe. The threat of nuclear annihilation brought the world to the brink of destruction, but it also sparked a new era of diplomacy, when nations sought to avoid war at all costs. The threat of mutually assured destruction, MAD, was a sobering realization. Vral, ever the tactician, nodded slowly. So, the threat of total destruction became a deterrent, and forced humanity to innovate once more, but this time in diplomacy. Yes, Zorath confirmed. And beyond the bomb, humanity's innovation didn't stop. They continued to develop space exploration, medical technologies, and advanced weapon systems. The need for survival, for protection against greater threats, kept pushing them forward. Xandria, still processing the magnitude of it all, asked, "What does all of this mean for humanity's future?" Zorath's eyes gleamed with excitement. "It means that humanity will continue to innovate. They may have faced a dark period, but they also overcame it. Every conflict has forced them to adapt, to invent, to push the boundaries of what's possible. And now, they're on the cusp of interstellar travel." The students sat in silence, each reflecting on the immense journey of humanity. They had come expecting to study a species defined by violence, but what they were learning was far more complex. Humanity was not just a force of destruction. They were a force of innovation, constantly evolving to meet the challenges that threatened their survival. Zorath smiled at them, knowing that their perception of Earth was shifting. Humanity's combat history is not just a story of bloodshed. It's a testament to their capacity for creativity and adaptation in the face of overwhelming odds. And that, he said, his voice filled with quiet pride, is what makes them so formidable. The students left the lecture hall that day with a new understanding. Humanity's true power didn't just lie in their ability to fight. It was in their relentless drive to improve, to innovate, and to survive, no matter what. The legacy of Earth's combat history. By the fourth day, the lecture hall was filled with a sense of anticipation. The students had been through 3 intense lessons on Earth's combat history, each one revealing new layers of complexity. Professor Zorath could see the shift in their understanding. They had come here expecting a primitive species defined by chaos, but now, they were witnessing a different side of humanity, one that was deeply resilient, innovative, and ultimately transformative. Today's lesson would be the culmination of everything they had learned so far. It wasn't just about the wars and the weapons or the tactics and technologies. It was about the legacy of Earth's combat history, the ripple effects that reverberated through time, shaping the modern world and influencing the galaxy at large. Zorath stood before his students, his eyes scanning the room. Xandria, who had once dismissed humanity as a species stuck in its violent past, now seemed more contemplative. Vral, the warrior from the Thalaka, appeared thoughtful, no longer so quick to judge. Tarak, ever the silent observer, had remained quiet throughout the lessons, but there was a sense of newfound respect in his gaze. Today, Zorath began, his voice heavy with significance. We will discuss the most important aspect of Earth combat history, its legacy. Not just the wars fought, the technologies developed, or the countless lives lost, but how these events have shaped humanity's place in the galaxy, and how they continue to influence their evolution. The holographic display came to life, showing images of Earth's modern era, cities that glittered with lights, vast networks of communication spanning the globe, and the bustling activity of the digital age. But Zorath wasn't showing them the idyllic vision of Earth that many in the galaxy saw. He focused on something more profound. Earth's wars didn't end with the world wars or the rise of nuclear weapons. Zorath continued, his tone somber. They set in motion a series of changes, social, political, and economic, that reverberated across time. He brought up a map of the world, showing a fractured timeline, wars between nations, revolutions, and uprisings. Humanity learned from each conflict, refining not just their weapons but their systems of governance and social structures. After the devastation of the world wars, they formed organizations like the United Nations, designed to prevent future conflict and encourage diplomacy. Xandria's brow furrowed. So, despite the violence, They learned to avoid more war. They focused on peace. Yes, Zorath replied. After the horrors of 2 world wars, humanity created systems that prioritized dialogue over destruction. This was a revolutionary shift for them, a recognition that the cost of war was far too great. They learned the value of cooperation, of working together to achieve stability. Vral, who had been skeptical of humanity's ability to learn from their past, nodded slowly. And what about their military prowess? How did they evolve their combat techniques after the wars? Humanity's military evolution didn't stop with the end of the world wars, Zorath said. While some of their most powerful weapons were developed for destruction, others were repurposed for peaceful means. Nuclear energy, for example, was initially a weapon of mass destruction, but it was later harnessed for power generation, fueling cities and industries. He switched the hologram to display the space programs that had taken root after the wars. The most significant transformation, however, came in the form of space exploration. The space race, which began as a competition between nations during the Cold War, ultimately led humanity to venture beyond their planet. The Apollo missions, the creation of the International Space Station, and their growing presence in space. This is the legacy of Earth's combat history. Humanity took the lessons learned from their wars and, instead of succumbing to self-destruction, they set their sights on the stars. Xandria, her voice tinged with wonder, asked, "You mean that their wars pushed them to explore the cosmos? To leave their home planet?" "Yes," Zorath said, a quiet pride in his voice. In the aftermath of so many wars, humanity realized that the greatest threat to their survival was not the enemy across the battlefield, but their own tendencies towards self-destruction. And so, they reached out, into space, into the unknown, seeking something greater than war. The International Space Station became a symbol of global cooperation, a testament to humanity's ability to unite even in the face of previous division. The hologram shifted once more, showing the first human footprints on the moon, then zooming out to show the intricate web of satellites that now encircled Earth. Today, humanity's legacy is one of peaceful coexistence, but also one of exploration. They are no longer just a species defined by war. They are a species that has learned, painfully at times, to transcend conflict in pursuit of progress. Tirak, the quiet student, spoke up for the first time in the lesson. But there are still wars. There is still conflict on Earth. They haven't fully learned it, have they? Zorath nodded solemnly. No species is perfect, Tirak. Even after so much destruction, Earth is still a world of contradictions. While humanity has made great strides toward peace, they still struggle with internal conflicts, be it ideological, political, or cultural. But what's important is how they continue to evolve, to learn from each failure. Their legacy isn't that they've eradicated all war. It's that they continue to survive, adapt, and rebuild. He turned to face the students, letting the final lessons settle in. Earth's combat history may be marked by violence and suffering, but it has also driven humanity to some of their greatest achievements. The war they fought against their own destructive instincts, their battle to find peace, to build alliances, to push beyond their home planet, has shaped the species they are today. A species capable of extraordinary resilience and ingenuity. A species that, despite its flaws, has never stopped striving for something better. The students sat in silence, each of them processing what they had just learned. They had come to study a planet of war and destruction, but now they saw something much more profound. Earth was a world of contradictions, of hope and despair, of destruction and renewal. And through it all, humanity had survived. As the lecture ended and the students began to file out, Zorath couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. He had shown them the true essence of Earth's history, not as a mere tale of battles and bloodshed, but as a story of survival, of resilience, and ultimately, of progress. The students, now with new perspectives, had learned that Earth's combat history was not simply about violence. It was about the human drive to evolve, to learn, and to transcend. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was the most profound lesson of all.